Shalom. There has been a resurgence of calendar talk over the past few weeks. Eddie Chumney, a prominent servant of our Elohim in the body of Messiah, someone I listened to many years ago when cutting my teeth on two-house teaching, and who I've had the privilege to meet a couple of times. He has recently revived the idea of the Zadokite calendar of the Qumran area, that this was the true calendar as given by God. And this has obviously caused a few responses from other servants like Rico Cortez and Ryan White, who they promote the calculated Hillel II calendar, I believe. And then there have been reaction from folks like Nathan Lawrence and now myself, who have Karaite leanings, which academics like the Orthodox Jew Sasha Stern, they call the empirical calendar because of our focus on observing harvests and seeing new moons. And there's no doubt in my mind that despite new doctrinal differences that emerge from the Zadok calendar camp, those in the camp are filled with the Spirit of God. They all desire the cohesion of the body of Messiah, that there's a genuineness in pursuing truth, and hopefully all parties in all calendars have a healthy dose of we could all be wrong. I'd imagine there could be nuance and different applications of the Zadok calendar, but hopefully I represent the general belief structure correctly and I don't create any straw man arguments in my questioning of the calendar. There really is one hill that the Zadok calendar lives or dies on. It's the question of the moon as a timepiece and whether it should be used in the biblical calendar. Concerning this, there's no hiding from this being the greatest statement of the Zadok calendar, which is that the moon has zero say in the setting of holy days. I'm not saying that the Zadok folk are saying the moon is useless. They, I'm certain, still understand its importance around tides, maybe with sowing and harvesting of crops, and that it is a beautiful object to behold and has effects in various ways. However, in terms of the calendar, the moon is of zero importance. Thus, in terms of Psalm 114, verse 19, we read, "He appointed the moon for seasons, the sun knows his going down." To take a Zadokite position, it requires all their adherents to put their shoulders back and say the moon, it has seasons for tides, for reproductive cycles of bugs apparently, but not the timekeeping of the biblical calendar. The Zadokite calendar at its core is purely a solar calendar. If this position of theirs is true, those who teach the Hillel II calendar and empirical folks like myself, we're obviously deceived in this regard and really off track. And for this reason, I'm going to give 10 reasons related to the moon and why I really think it is and was created by our Father as a central part of timekeeping within the law of our God. Lunar solar calendars are, according to history, considered more ancient, and purely solar calendar months were novel inventions. When looking at the old and middle kingdoms of Egypt, the moon cycle was used originally for months. The earliest example in the Middle East of a purely solar calendar like the Zadokite one comes from the New Kingdom of the Egyptians. At this time they created a civic calendar that was purely solar. It had 12 lots of 30-day periods. This allowed them to make a calendar of perfect 30-day segments because the lunar months of the Old and Middle Kingdom would have oscillated between hollow 30-day months, where day 30 was shared with day 1 of the next month, and full 30-day months, with day 30 and day 1 for the next month being on separate days. The New Kingdom's perfect solar 30-day months was historically novel a fresh idea at this time in the region. It was elegant and a simple repeated 30-day count, like the week in a sense, and it just required an extra 5 days to get to the all-important length of 365 days in a tropical year. Rome, as everyone in the West should know, also developed a truly solar calendar whose precision guiding it is near perfection since Pope Gregory. Roman solar calendars were not, however, historically Rome's original calendar. History tells us that it developed because originally the moon was used for months, and that the solar calendar came from a frustration of 12 lunar months being 11 days short of the 365.24 tropical year. The Roman calendar was first developed as a lunar calendar, so it was difficult for the Romans to reconcile this with the natural solar year. The Romans would, a few centuries after the Egyptians, gravitate from the ancient way of tying months to the lunar cycle, and eventually also created solar months, no longer tied to the waxing and waning of the moon, and with a few more days in their months would make up the 11-day shortfall and get to the 365-day target. Historically, solar months were new to the scene, and they simplified frustrations in the older observational moon-based calendars. Governments would no longer have the unknown workings out of hollow and full 30-day lunar cycles, and would only need a leap day once in every 4 years, as opposed to a whole leap month done by repeating the 12th month roughly every 3 years. Which was a feature of all lunar solar calendar systems. Even the solar calendar of the Mayans, which everyone thinks is really old, it's known to have been preceded by a lunar calendar, and it was most likely modified for the same reasons the Egyptians and the Romans had, for control and predictability. However, be aware, in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the world really seemed to operate with lunar calendars, with the first evidence of a purely solar calendar in the Middle East, as said, only coming with the Egyptian New Kingdom's civil calendar. Solar months were novel creations to mimic the prior lunar months, and were always understood as not the original, and Rome still gave testimony to their original start in spring, which preceded January as the original beginning of the year in ancient cultures, Hebrew included. So the seventh moon cycle from spring was around September. October was historically the time of the 8th cycle, and so on. Failing to understand the earlier moon cycle these solar months were connected to is like thinking the horsepower of a car is because the car is the original horse. The same way that children today may be surprised to learn that a modern day notebook is not the original notebook. Okay, number 2. The Zadok calendar folk must explain why less predictive and controllable lunar cycles were adopted. It's not just provable that solar calendars emerged from prior lunar calendars, but it is easy to believe. Those of the Zadok camp must believe that the world went from their original solar calendar to an observational lunar calendar at a very early point in history. However, this is not intuitive knowing human nature, especially when knowing the Zadok calendar had these characteristics. Firstly, it allowed people to predict and plan with almost perfect certainty into the year ahead, not just on a monthly level, but if I understand correctly, on a weekly level as well. B, it has no complexity in whether a month would be a hollow 30 days or a full 30 days in length. All months are always a full 30 days. And then lastly, it makes perfect seasons with the grouping of 3 months and an insertion of equinox and solstice days, creating 4 91-day perfect seasons with an elegant 364-day calendar. Imagine trying to convince the king of a land to abandon a Zadok calendar for a system where the king would have to give the population every 30th day of the lunar cycle for the observation and determination of the new moon. The most ancient lunar months required an informal holiday of sorts for subjects of a kingdom to give testimony to a central government to certify the moon sighting by reputable witnesses. Kings and governments would, as said, have to give up their predictive ability over months and weeks for a calendar with less predictive power on both weekly and monthly timeframes. As someone who does an observational moon calendar like the Jews largely did up until 300 years after Messiah's ascension, I can only with absolute certainty receive feast dates for the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Tabernacles 15 days before those celebrations. And then we also have kings would need to embrace the new idea of a whole leap month to get the moon cycle to catch up with the tropical solar year every 3 years or so. It is so against the grain to assume that a purely solar calendar could find almost unanimous political will in the ancient world to make changes to incorporate observational lunar elements. India got rid of the British Empire, but they kept the Gregorian solar calendar brought from Europe. And although the Chinese, they recognize the ancient lunar cycle of their forebears, they've adopted the Gregorian calendar as well. Man gravitates towards ease, and ancient observational lunar calendars are noted for their abandonment time and time again for solar calendars. It's not the other way around, which the Zadok calendar requires us to believe happened early after the flood. The third one is that the languages of the world bear testament to lunar months. Although the Western world has, by and large, abandoned the moon in matters of calendar for millennia now, languages bear testimony that the months are moons, the man for the mont, the Hebrew, in Hebrew, the yerach for the yerach. Some cultures call months a lunar, so we get the picture. This is why I've been saying solar months, and I'll keep trying to do that, which hopefully he understands, because as with horses and cars and electric devices with notebooks, we have to get this the right way around. The English vocabulary struggles to give a word that isn't related to the moon for the 30-day cycles in a purely solar calendar. Europe, I don't think, has a word that cannot be connected somehow to the moon. I believe this should not be ignored. Languages point to the natural timepiece of the moon that ancients would have looked at. I find it hard to believe that it would have been a new novel idea to think in primitive times that people would have suddenly had the idea of tracking the moon and so created a new novel month idea. Using the moon for months is as intuitive as using the sun for sunrises and sunsets. Number 4, the Bible equates the month with a lunar cycle. The Zadok calendar has to put its stake down and say that the Chodesh or scripture, translated as month 250 times, it just means new and is not about the monthly renewal of the moon cycle, but is a new 30-day period in a segmented solar year that's completely disconnected from a moon cycle. We must ask, is this true? In the early days of Solomon's reign, when he was walking in the ways of God and setting up the temple to perform monthly offerings, Solomon would equate the month in Israel with the ancient practice of the world that still did observational lunar months. This is seen in 1 Kings chapter 6, 38 and 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 2. Now, your average Bible will not discern this because two different Hebrew words are both translated as month because translators almost unanimously believe that the Hebrew word for renewal, chodesh, and a moon cycle, yerach, are considered the same thing, a month. 1 Kings 6:38, and in the 11th year in the month yerach, moon cycle, Bul, which is the 8th month, and here we see the Hebrew word chodesh, renewal. Was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, and according to all the fashion of it, so was he 7 years in building it. And then 1 Kings 8:2, and all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon at the feast in the month, here the word yerach is used for moon cycle, of Ethanim, which is the 7th month, chodesh, renewal. We could not ask for a better synonym for chodesh, renewal, than what we find in these two scriptures. If there's one thing that we can connect to the chodesh, it is the yerach, the moon cycle. Scholars believe here Solomon was connecting Canaanite months like Bul and Ethanim with the Hebrew months, because in Mesopotamia and the whole Levant, this was the same common ancient practice for determining months. Months were lunar by definition until the later solar reinventions that mimicked lunar months began to become more dominant. Centuries later, Ezra and Esther would also speak of the chodesh and yerach as synonyms for the month. This was not some later confusion in Babylon. Rather, the yerach and the chodesh were just used synonymously. This can be seen with Ezra calling the Babylonian month called Adar a yerach, and in Esther it being called a chodesh. They were the same thing, lunar month descriptions. The fifth objection: if the moon cycle as a timekeeping idea is a deceptive idea, why is it specifically used in certain biblical contexts? If those of the Zadokite calendar wish to say that the lunar month was an Egyptian false doctrine of timekeeping, if this is true, we would need a good response from the Zadok folk to explain why God would therefore suddenly use the moon as a timepiece in his own law subsequent to coming out of Egypt. This is seen in Deuteronomy 21:13, where a captive woman had to mourn her parents for a full lunar cycle. Again, if pagan, when Moses was editing the book of the law after leaving Egypt, we should rightly ask, why would he describe his mother concealing him from death in Exodus 2 verse 2 as being 3 moon cycles long? He surely could have just said 90 days or used the supposed chodesh that the Zadok calendar folk would have us believe had nothing at this time to do with lunar cycles. And then there is also Job. A righteous man would poetically wish his birth had never been counted in a year or moon cycle sense as well. Why was this ancient figure influenced by what is considered a false idea? The same too, there's something about in Job as well about the birthing of goats, which is also, he uses the idea of connecting it with moon cycles. Okay, number 6. Numbered Hebrew months are in fact synchronized with Babylonian months. Eddie Chumney maybe just made a mistake here, but the claim was made that the biblical Hebrew chodesh is referred to by numbers. This is true, but he goes on to say, if I understand correctly, that the numbered months of the Israelites had nothing to do with the named months that we read of in Scripture that come from Babylon, Canaan, and Egypt. And the opposite seems to be true in this regard. The house of Judah in Babylon would equate their original Hebrew numbered system of months with the month names that the Babylonians gave to their lunar cycles, just like Solomon did with Bul and Ethanim. You see this Esther 2:16. Here it speaks about in the 10th month, which is the month Tebet. Esther 3:7 in the first month, that is the month Nisan. Further down, you'll see the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Esther 8 also talks about the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan. If believing the Babylonian months are wrong reckonings of time, Zadokites, I would assume, would also have to deem the Jewish festival of Purim as being reckoned through a false moon system. This because we're only told in the text that Purim was to be on the 14th and 15th of Adar, a Babylonian month description. Of course, historically, this has just been seen as the same as the 12th Hebrew month, but for the name, it is common knowledge that they were the same time period, as we see in Esther 9:1. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Okay, the 7th point, Ezekiel's 13th month. A feature of the lunar of lunar months being kept in sync with harvest seasons is that the lunar solar calendars require a leap month every 3 years or so. Now, concerning the leap month, there seems to be evidence for a 13th month in analyzing the time period surrounding Ezekiel's repentance for 430 days for the house of Israel and Judah. He was commanded to lie on his side. You may remember this. For the duration of this repentant act, the Zadok calendar would, according to my understanding, have insufficient days to get to the 430 days required to have been reached by the 5th of the 6th month. However, if there was a leap month that year, then we can account for why Ezekiel would be sitting up by the 5th of the 6th month in the following year. I don't want to spend too much on this argument. You can argue that he only did the part of repentance for the house of Israel and later completed the rest, but just to say this really seems to be evidence that that year had an extra month. Okay, point 8. The Feast of Shavuot points to ancient Israel using an observational lunar calendar. The Feast of Shavuot is the only Chag, festival appointment, in the law of Moses that has no month date. The reason is simply understood when understanding ancient months. In an observational lunar calendar, there was no predictive power over the sighting of the new moon and how full and hollow months would pan out because of a few factors, like the elliptical orbit of the moon, cloud cover, other factors. So to simplify, the 50-day count to Pentecost, Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, therefore could not be predicted to end every year on a specific month date. And this is why God never gave it a specific month date. Right now, in the observational calendar, I can't give you the month date for Shavuot, even though we are on day 14 of the count. I don't know if this month will be hollow or full. This is the most clear evidence that the law was dealing with Chodesh periods based on lunar months. And some would say this is an argument from silence. However, the silence in the Torah speaks loudly because this isn't just a once-off in Leviticus 23, but this is the exact same case in Numbers 28. God, it would seem, can't give a fixed monthly date because he never wanted the months to be that predictable. The 9th point, to try and solidify the use of the moon in the original calendar, the Chodesh festival has hallmarks of end of the month lunar fest. I've actually recently begun trying to get back into the festive element around determining day one, but with timeanddate.com, I can understand why people in my camp are not really keeping it the ancient way, because of the relative certainty we have today on when the moon should be seen. Note that, however, the ancients kept this time at the head of the month in a kind of limbo because they did not have as much certainty to know the likelihood of spotting the next new moon. The best they could do was to narrow it down to the likelihood of it being seen on 2 possible nights. For this reason, they would have a Chodesh festival time around day 30. And at the start of the 30th day, the nation would have their first possible sighting of the moon. If seen, it was obviously a hollow month, and communities would have a civic duty to send witnesses up to the government to help confirm the start of the month on that day. Those in the government, they'd wait on the 30th day for possible reports, and if not receiving testimony, they would sight the following night as well, and depending on observations, would make a call and let the nation know whether it was a hollow or a full month, and then life would go on. This rough and general description is what is basically understood to be what the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, Hebrews, the Sumerians, Persians, Babylonians, Indians, Tibetans, Chinese, even in the Americas, the Incas and the Mayans. Just like observing the moon would require embracing hollow and full months and the concept of a leap month, so too all day 30s would have to have this kind of reality to them. Now, when reading of the Chodesh Fest in the ancient of the ancient Hebrews in 1 Samuel, the two evening nature surrounding the time of month determination just stands out as being characteristic of ancient observations at the end of the month. The 30th day for determining the new moon had a very similar feel in the day of the Second Temple in that period. Even after the end of the Sanhedrin, the destruction of the temple, for the next 300 years, local Jewish communities in the diaspora would still sight the moon, with now elders in the scattered community certifying the new month. With the introduction of the calculator Hillel II calendar in the 4th century, the observational elements of the day fell away from the Jewish world, and Rosh Chodesh, head of the month, for the first time in Israelite history, I believe, became subjected to mathematical calculation. Calculation that started in Babylon and then attributed to Meton of Athens. It has the mathematics of, I think it's 6 or 7 leap months in a 19-year cycle. All in all, I think we have a healthy picture of the historical trace for lunar Rosh Chodesh festivals through time, and that they do go back to a genuine ancient practice for the determining of new months, where people with limited control over knowing when the first sliver of the new moon would be would pause to determine the start of the month. All right, the 10th one. Challenges with Messiah's death and resurrection. Now, if I understand the Zadok calendar correctly, the 14th of the first month will always be on a Tuesday, and we have strong reasons to believe that the 14th was when Yeshua died. This has brought up challenges in Messiah's description of his resurrection being on the 3rd day, as this seems quite early for the Passover in that week. Inclusive ideas would have him rising on Thursday, only to be discovered on the Sunday, and even with broader ideas of a non-literal or a literal 3 days and 3 nights, we have him rising in that year somewhere on Friday afternoon, and choosing to be discovered only on the day after the Sabbath, which he could obviously choose to do, but this feels a little strange. In the Zadok camp, they can't use the idea of him waiting a day and a bit so that he would fulfill ideas of the first fruits, because the Zadok people have the day of the first fruits as occurring on the Sunday after the feast, not during it. There are also issues why the guards were still guarding the tomb on the first day of the week, when they were only to secure it till the 3rd day. The disciples on the road to Emmaus on the day of his appearance would also speak of his appearances happening on the 3rd day, and we're almost 100% certain it was the day after the Sabbath, weekly Sabbath, and so I don't quite see how it played out. When it comes to calendar things and sometimes seeing things really differently, I'm reminded of Polycrates, the overseer of Smyrna, and how he went to Rome to try and clear up some issues around the Passover, and there were many issues at that time. Polycrates in the Asian church, they were still keeping the days of unleavened bread. Yet despite glaring differences, he broke bread with Pope Anicetus as symbolic of how, even though they saw things differently, that they should never forget that there is one body of Messiah. And I think this is a healthy way of dealing with certain divisions. Because not all are because of willful sin. Some are because of different interpretations, and there is no insincerity at play. He judges our hearts, and I have a feeling few of us are like Nathaniel as Israelites without guile. We all have biases. I just hope that mine are sincere, because the heart deceives. And clearly, sometimes we look at things differently, and all we can pray is that we can see where either we are blind or where through Jehovah's grace we may have light to help others discern their errors. Perhaps here with calendars is the need to also mention the wisdom of John. In speaking of the Chadash, new commandment, like Chodesh, there is a great renewal, but he stressed that, it must be in Messiah. Thus, in reviving ancient calendars, foremost, let us revive them in him, and I think his heart would be that we soberly, mindfully, and prayerfully consider all things. As John said in 1 John 2, 7 and 8, Brethren, I write no new command unto you, but an old commandment which you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard from the beginning. Again, a new commandment I write unto you, which thing is true in him and in you. Because the darkness is past, and the true light now shineth. Whatever the interpretation, he ultimately is the light, not the sun, not the moon. Our Messiah is the forever light. And I must believe he wants us to see the light, but maybe we look in the wrong place, at the wrong time, at the wrong thing. But we must not stop looking. He is the true light. And he warned that those who definitely will be deceived and in darkness are Hillel II type people who think they see it all and get smug in their positions, or when empirical people like myself believe that we're suddenly the light, we need to bring the light to all the blinded ones out there. May we stay humble, may we all seek our Master's heart, and all things be renewed in him. May darkness pass and true light shine. Much shalom to you as we continue our count up to Shavuot and get excited for that time. Blessings.